Imagine you're a young Roman student sitting in a noisy classroom. Your teacher is pacing the room with a wax tablet in one hand. You and your classmates are reciting a dialogue in Greek. If you want, come with me. Where? To our friend Lucius. Let's go see him. What's wrong with him? He's sick. Since when? A few days ago, he fell ill. Where does he live? Not far off. Please walk there with me. It's language class, 2,000 years ago. Welcome to Jack of All Languages, the show where we travel through time and across cultures, one language at a time. Or sometimes, I guess, 2 or 3 languages at a time. Anyway, today we're going to talk about how people in ancient times and in medieval times learned languages. Before the age of language learning apps, Skype calls with language teachers, YouTube videos, podcasts, and language vlogs, learning a language must have been super different, right? Well, the techniques people used to learn languages might actually surprise you, because some of them really aren't all that different from the techniques that we use today. So let's get started. To begin, let's rewind to the ancient Mediterranean. Greece and Rome are where I want to take you today, because although people all over the ancient world surely learned foreign languages, Greece and Rome left us some of the best documentation of how they did it. Ancient Greeks and Romans often learned each other's languages. Romans such as Julius Caesar and Cicero and Augustus spoke fluent Greek and used it in their political and intellectual lives. The classical Greeks, though, they had different opinions about foreign languages. They were said to have a little bit more of an attitude about learning languages other than their own, preferring to believe that their language was superior to all others. But in practice, we know that they too often learned Latin in order to communicate with foreigners during the time of the Roman Empire. And speakers of other languages across the Mediterranean world, languages like Oscan, Umbrian, Etruscan, Aramaic, and Phrygian, also frequently learned Latin or Greek, whether through trade, military service, travel, migration, and immigration, or for the educated minority just for the sake of education. For the vast majority of people, though, the common people, we might say, languages were not learned through classes or reading, but through a kind of immersion. This way of learning would have required many years of exposure and lots of listening and repeating the target language. Basically, it was a method of trial and error. These learners would have included soldiers, immigrants, refugees, and merchants. The very nature of this way of learning meant that it lacks written evidence. Many of these learners were illiterate, and again, they weren't using textbooks to learn languages. The kind of ancient language learning we do have written records of is that of the educated minority, the literate nobles and scribes and bureaucrats who took classes in foreign languages and used grammar textbooks and did translation exercises and things of that sort. And these learners were kind of the ancient equivalent of how most people study languages today, through focused study of grammar and vocabulary. So let's take a look at the methods these learners used. In the Mediterranean world in ancient times, the most common foreign languages to learn by far were Latin and Greek. To start, many learners used bilingual texts known as Colloquia, which featured dialogues written in the target language in one column and in the known language in another column. And these were matched up line for line. So as a student, you would know this line with these words in Latin corresponds to this line in Greek, for example. And these dialogues were all about daily life in ancient Rome. They were dialogues about how to use the baths, going to the bank, buying food at the market, visiting the temples. They also included dialogues about daily routines, like eating lunch or doing your homework. Here's an example of one of these in which someone claims that another person owes him money, and the accused person responds by saying his accuser is insane. It's very entertaining stuff. And the translation is the work of a wonderful scholar named Eleanor Dickey, whose specialty is ancient language learning. And I'll leave links to more of her work down in the description. Okay, I'll just read the English, but you can read along with the Latin to get a feel for the original text. Isn't this fellow Lucius, who has my money? This is he, so approaching him, I shall greet him. Hello, master of a household. Can't I yet have back my money that you have been owing me for such a long time? What are you saying? You're insane. I lent you money and you say you're insane? Swindler, don't you know me? Take yourself off. Look for whom you lent it to, for I don't have anything of yours. Texts like this provided students with useful sentence structures, colloquial phrases, and vocabulary. And perhaps most important of all, They were fun. I think these are just amazing, and as modern language learners, we can learn a lot from them. Of course, ancient students also studied vocabulary and grammar, but by diving into real-world conversations from the very beginning of their studies, they were preparing themselves really well to actually communicate in their target language, while learning grammar more immersively through input. Another technique ancient students used to learn Greek and Latin was memorizing long lists of vocabulary grouped by certain themes. So maybe one week you learn names of planets, the next week you learn parts of the body, and then foods and beverages. This technique I don't recommend quite as much, but it helped them out a lot because classical Latin texts typically did not have any spacing between words. So if you were just starting out and you didn't know much Latin, you would have no idea where one word ends and the next one begins in the text you were reading. And finally, when they reached a high enough level, these students would read authentic texts in the target language. So if you were learning Greek, you might read Homer, and if you were learning Latin, you could read Virgil. We don't know how much conversation practice students got, but based on the Colloquia, which features some classroom dialogues where the teacher and students are speaking in Latin, it seems like classes were often conducted in the target language once the students could speak it well enough. So maybe that's how they got their conversational practice. So let's jump forward in time half a millennium now to the Anglo-Saxon period in England, where literate students often use very similar methods to learn Latin. So who learned Latin in Anglo-Saxon England and how? Like in ancient Rome and Greece, the majority of people in Anglo-Saxon England were illiterate. King Alfred the Great attempted to improve literacy in England during his reign, implementing educational reforms aimed at teaching students to read and write in both Old English and Latin. But for the most part, literacy remained very low. But for the few people fortunate enough to receive an education, mostly male students at monastic schools, Latin studies looked a lot like they did in ancient Rome. In fact, the same texts, featuring dialogues from daily life, were adapted to teach Latin to English students. The most famous of these is Ælfric of Eynshama's Colloquies. Like the Roman Colloquia that we saw earlier, these dialogues featured conversations in a classroom setting between teacher and students that could be used by students for role-playing. Ælfric of Eynsham had a student named Ælfric of Bata, and he wrote another set of colloquies that were even more entertaining than his teachers. Ælfric of Bata must have realized that textbooks can be pretty boring, so he decided to spice things up in his dialogues. His colloquies are full of dramatic altercations and nasty insults directed at lazy students, where teachers and students call each other turds and seeds of a demon and cow dung. I'll read a short excerpt here, and I apologize for Ælfric's language. Now your words reveal the truth that you are a buffoon and a fool and a silly blabbermouth. You don't know how to do anything better than to use your stinking, stupid words to beshit and befoul those who come to you. I think these dialogues must have been pretty entertaining for English boys in the Middle Ages, and they remain very entertaining today. And apart from entertaining, they seem to have been pretty effective too. England produced some remarkable Latin scholars across the early medieval period, from Aldhelm of Malmesbury to the Venerable Bede to Alcuin of York, who was called the most learned anywhere to be found by Charlemagne's biographer. What I love about these dialogues is how modern they feel. Think about it. Dialogues, repetition, role-playing. The Romans basically invented the language textbook 2,000 years ago, and the Anglo-Saxons later took up this method, and in a way, we're still using the same approach today. As the Middle Ages progressed, the same basic model continued, though by the later period, more learners were studying vernaculars, like French, Italian, and German, alongside Latin. As these vernacular languages became popular and prestigious foreign languages to learn, guidebooks and dictionaries, as well as bilingual readers like the ones we've discussed, began to circulate and gain popularity among merchants and travelers. One Arnold von Harff, from Cologne, Germany, traveled extensively across Europe and the Middle East, recording in his journal alphabets and important words and phrases from the local languages wherever he went. The journals were structured the same for each language. They featured basic words like bread, wine, and water, numerals and greetings, and phrases like, "Where is the inn?" and "Lady, may I sleep with you?" Finally, another context in which language learning was done was mission work. For a long time, the Roman Church held that Latin should be the universal language of Christendom. However, They realized that learning local languages was fundamental to converting people to Christianity in the first place. Missionaries often had no choice but to learn the local language or dialect when they traveled to a non-Latin speaking area. It was in this context that dictionaries for languages like Arabic and Persian were created, and that the Council of Vienne decided to appoint professors at Europe's major universities for languages like Hebrew, Greek, and what they called Chaldean, an ancient form of Aramaic. With all that said, it's important to remember again that the majority of language learning was done by non-literate people using non-literary methods. Much later, in the 20th century, Jaroslav Hašek wrote a novel called The Good Soldier Švejk, in which the main character, Švejk, who is Czech, is asked by his lieutenant how he learned German so well. "Well, it just happened," he replies. For many people throughout history who have learned a foreign language, it was likely a similar story. No grammar, no vocab lists, no books, just a lot of exposure. That's all for today. Thank you for watching Jack of All Languages. I hope you got something out of this episode, and I hope you're perhaps feeling inspired to inject some fun into your own language learning. There are certainly some pros and cons to the methods we heard about today, but I can for sure vouch for the idea that keeping language learning lighthearted and entertaining is a surefire way to keep yourself engaged and excited about your studies. Let me know in the comments what techniques you use to learn languages, and if you try any of these ancient methods yourself, let me know how it goes.